This weekend, the church celebrates the Feast of the Presentation of the Lord. It does so every year on February 2nd, but it only occasionally falls on Sunday. So most years you probably never notice the feast day because it's not one we're obliged to participate in. Back before the Second Vatican Council, this actually was a bit more important. It marks 40 days after Jesus' birth and the conclusion of the Christmas season. So, you still had your trees up and everything until now. Now Christmas is finally over. No. The presentation of the Lord recalls the day when Mary and Joseph brought the infant Jesus into the temple to dedicate him to God. And this was a normal event for the life of Jews. According to God's law, every firstborn son was to be consecrated to God, a kind of giving back to God the first fruits of their family. On the outside, therefore, this day would have appeared to be as any other, as the Holy Family was just simply among any of the other couples, bringing their firstborn sons to be offered to God. But it says that the elderly Simeon, the man described as righteous and devout, along with the prophetess Anna, a widow who had spent much of her time in prayer, the two of them recognized that there's something different with this child in particular. Certainly they knew all the promises of the coming Messiah. For example, like the prophecy described in the first reading from the prophet Malachi, suddenly there would come to the temple of the Lord, to the temple, the Lord whom you seek, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire. So great is Simeon's faith that he doesn't need to see this child grow up. Just this one moment is enough for him as he says, "Now, Master, you may let your servant go in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all the peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." And this canticle, Simeon is speaking of seeing God's light being revealed. Jesus is the light of revelation for the Gentiles, the light for all peoples. So at his presentation, now this was at an ordinary event in Jewish life, and it teaches us too that Jesus becomes our light to guide us during the ordinary events of our life as well. Simeon and Anna, they encounter Jesus there at the temple. And in that also, our encounter of Jesus also happens in the church. But by the church, I don't simply mean just inside this building. Certainly it does happen here in the church building. We encounter Jesus just as Simeon encountered this single glimpse of Jesus. Here we have many glimpses of Jesus every time we celebrate the Eucharist. But our encounter with God, seeing his light, not only occurs in this church building, but it also occurs in the church, which is our whole life together as Christians, in the ordinary daily events. Every day, God is revealing to us his presence. But do we always recognize when he does so? And there's several practices that we can do within our faith to help recognize God's active presence in our life. I've been suggesting some as we've been doing our Sunday Sparks. For example, practicing the presence of God, stopping at different moments throughout our day to recall that he's with us. Or the discernment of spirits, which I've been doing recently. Another helpful practice that can help us to think of how God is working, to recognize him in the ordinary things, is something the church encourages us to do before we go to bed at the end of the day. Something called the daily examen. It's a technique of reflection over the events that happened during that day, to try to recognize where God's presence and what his direction was. Sometimes it's easier to recognize it after things have happened rather than in the moment. So to do an examen at the end of our day, as part of your prayers before you go to bed, No, first we ask for God's light, ask Him to help us to understand where He's been in our lives that day. And then we think back through what has gone. Don't have to remember every single moment, but what stands out? Were there certain moments, certain emotions, things that we went through that day? Were there times of consolations where we felt close to God, or we noticed Him at work? Or were there times of the opposite, desolations, where we felt that God was far away and we're not sure where He was working? And so we should thank God for any gifts and blessings that we had from that day, and thank Him for allowing us to recognize that's where He was at work. If we notice moments where we failed to respond to God, maybe when we weren't at our best, then we can ask for forgiveness for our sins. And then finally, looking ahead to the day to come, we should ask God for the grace in order to follow Him better the next day. So that's the habit of the daily examine. And if we institute that practice in our life, we'll find that it becomes much easier each day to notice those ways in which God is moving in our lives and how we're supposed to respond and follow Him. And this practice of the daily examine is actually part of the church's official prayers in the church. Her official Liturgy of the Hours, night prayer from that, includes this examine. Examining our day can take all of those hectic happenings that might occur and put them in that proper perspective. How did all those things relate to God? Where was He at work? And it can bring greater peace to our racing minds sometimes at the end of the day, and a greater trust that God is with us. Having made a nighttime examine as part of night prayer, the church also, in her official liturgy, includes having us pray the very same canticle that Simeon prayed when he recognized God's light there appearing with him. Lord, now you let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My own eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared in the sight of every people, a light to reveal you to the nations and the glory of your people Israel. So this canticle is on the lips of the church every single night. Regardless of whether you specifically have prayed it, it's on the lips of priests and religious across the world every single night before we go to bed. We can go to sleep in peace because, having examined what occurred throughout our day, we've recognized God was at work no matter what happened. And whether everything that happened was according to our liking, or things occurred that were unexpected or disappointing, our eyes have been able to see how He's working His salvation through it all. When Jesus was presented in the temple, it was an ordinary part of their life, but its real meaning was so much more. That God Himself was coming to His temple to meet His people. So we too should reflect on our day, on our past week. How was Jesus there? Hidden perhaps in the normal course of events. Jesus, help us to see your salvation, that we can rest each night in peace.